Beneath the ashes of war and the silence of archives lie stories never meant to surface. Fragments of coded transmissions, erased files, and shadows stitched into Europe's ruins. They whisper of scientists who vanished at sea, experiments buried under stone, and weapons tested not on battlefields, but on human endurance. These are not myths or legends. They are scars deliberately hidden, echoes of a war that refused to end, and the secrets that governments still will not name aloud. On the night of April 28, 1945, with Berlin burning and the Reich's command structure collapsing, a small unit of the British 30 Assault Unit, the Signals Intelligence Detachment originally formed at Ian Fleming's urging, picked up a fragmentary transmission emanating from a location near Kiel. The Morse code, heavily distorted by interference, carried the call sign Seewolf Zwei. For weeks, Allied monitors had been intercepting chatter about remnants of the Kriegsmarine preparing last-ditch submarine operations, but this transmission stood out. It was not directed to headquarters in Berlin, nor to any surface fleet. Its recipient was unknown, its encryption unbroken, and its timing, so close to Germany's capitulation, alarming. The decoded portion that did survive was chilling in its precision. Coordinates leading not toward the Norwegian coast, where most surviving U-boats were bottled, but southwest, toward the Atlantic lanes leading to South America. The message referenced special cargo and wissenschaftliches Personal, scientific personnel. At the time, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park annotated the intercept with a red pencil mark and the word priority. Yet when the war in Europe officially ended on May 8th, the file was quietly shelved. Too many fragments were missing, too many leads ambiguous. By August 1945, however, a second and far more direct confirmation emerged. A Dutch fisherman reported spotting a surfaced U-boat near the Azores. Unlike the battered hulls being surrendered, on Massa II Allied ports, this vessel bore no identification markings. The fisherman described crates being transferred onto a disguised trawler under cover of darkness. The report was logged by Royal Navy intelligence as unconfirmed. Within 3 weeks, the fisherman had vanished, last seen boarding a train from Rotterdam to Amsterdam. No further trace of him was found. The missing puzzle pieces began to coalesce in 1946, when MI6's Section 9, the counterintelligence branch, focused on Soviet espionage, received testimony from a captured Abwehr officer in Hamburg. The officer, Oberstleutnant Karl Voss, admitted under interrogation that in February 1945 he was briefed on a contingency plan to redeploy vital scientific assets beyond Reich borders. He named it Operation Seewolf Zwei. According to Voss, the plan involved a flotilla of at least 3 submarines, outfitted not for combat, but for transport. Their cargo included physicists associated with the Reich's atomic research, several Luftwaffe engineers attached to Messerschmitt's jet program, and prototypes of electromagnetic propulsion devices, whose specifications remain contested. Voss's testimony was filed under HS 8442 and classified most secret. The file disappeared into Whitehall's secure registry by 1947. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the US Navy was conducting its own inquiries. Project Overcast, which would evolve into Operation Paperclip, had already secured dozens of German scientists for American military research. Yet Navy files reveal growing concern that the British were suppressing intelligence about others who had slipped away. In a memorandum dated March 3, 1947, Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter wrote, "It is the considered opinion of this office that Allied partners have concealed details of Seewolf transmissions. Evidence suggests Reich scientists escaped maritime interdiction and may presently be at liberty in South American republics." His letter was copied to the Office of Naval Intelligence but bore no follow-up notations. What happened to the so-called Seewolf convoys? Declassified Argentine naval records from 1951 offer a possible answer. In a patrol report marked confidential, an Argentine destroyer claimed radar contact with a submerged vessel off Mar del Plata. just weeks before the notorious arrival of U-977 and U-530, two U-boats that had mysteriously surrendered in Argentina months after Germany's defeat. While those boats were officially dismissed as stragglers, their commanders refusing to clarify their orders, the destroyer's report included a curious addendum. Floating debris marked with the insignia of IG Farben, the industrial conglomerate deeply tied to Nazi research. Buenos Aires denied knowledge of further landings. Survivors' accounts add another layer. In 1958, a former sailor of the Kriegsmarine, speaking under anonymity in a Hamburg tavern, told a journalist from Der Spiegel that he had crewed on a phantom voyage, transporting the professor and his assistants to a safe harbor in Patagonia. His story, dismissed at the time as drunken invention, aligns uncomfortably with testimonies collected decades later from Chilean fishermen who recalled German-speaking men arriving in remote coastal villages during the late 1940s. British intelligence maintained silence. The National Archives release of 1978 included fragments of the original Schleswig-Holstein Intercept, but the bulk of the Seewolf files remained missing. One memo, unsigned but dated May 9, 1945, carried only a single typed line: "Cargo delivered. Orders executed. Seewolf concluded." The context is unknown, and the document's authenticity has been contested by archivists, yet its phrasing carries the unmistakable cadence of a post-operation confirmation. Cold War dynamics buried the matter further. With West Germany rearmed and integrated into NATO, the last thing London or Washington desired was a renewed investigation into escaped Nazi assets, potentially sheltered in sympathetic regimes abroad. South America became a theater of shadows, where intelligence agencies quietly hunted exiled war criminals while turning a blind eye to the origins of advanced technology suddenly appearing in aerospace and missile development programs. What remains most disturbing are the implications. If Operation Seewolf Zwei successfully evacuated its personnel, then critical segments of German wartime science, including those not absorbed into paperclip or Soviet equivalents, remained beyond Allied control. The appearance of advanced jet prototypes in Argentina's ill-fated Pulque 2 project during the 1950s, or rumors of electromagnetic experiments conducted in remote Patagonian facilities, suggest the possibility of a hidden lineage. None of this has been admitted publicly, but classified memoranda speak to nervous whispers at the highest levels of NATO command. The official record closes with silence. No Seewolf submarines were ever recovered, no manifests, no crew rosters, no final reports. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. A message intercepted at the war's end, missing scientists never accounted for, unexplained sightings at sea, and a trail of files stamped "most secret" before vanishing into the locked drawers of intelligence archives. In the long aftermath of the Second World War, one truth remains clear. Not all of the Reich surrendered in May 1945. Some simply vanished beneath the Atlantic waves, taking with them technologies and secrets meant for a war that never officially ended. In February 1945, as Allied bombers reduced Dresden to ash, few could imagine the city would later become the focal point of one of the Cold War's most persistent rumors. The firestorm that consumed tens of thousands concealed not only the dead, but something buried deeper beneath the rubble, what Soviet recovery units would later classify as Material Group Z. According to fragmentary reports, now declassified from the Russian Ministry of Defense, these materials were not ordinary munitions or armaments, but remnants of experimental aircraft and chemical fuel compounds seized from hidden Luftwaffe research depots. Western intelligence circles would later call it the Dresden Cache. When the Red Army entered the city on May 8, 1945, their engineers combed through cellars and underground shelters for weeks, retrieving weapon stores and searching for surviving German command staff. A field report filed by 3rd Guards Tank Army mentioned discovering sealed containers beneath the collapsed Reichsluftfahrtministerium annex on Borsbergstrasse. These containers were marked with the Reich Eagle and swastika, along with cryptic reference codes beginning with EIV. Inside, Soviet engineers reportedly found half-melted fuselage segments made of alloys unfamiliar to their metallurgists, as well as documents outlining experimental propulsion systems. Alongside the debris were jars of a reddish liquid identified only as Kraftstoff C13. By 1946, these materials had been transported under armed guard to the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute in Moscow. Soviet scientists tasked with analyzing them recorded in internal memos that the metals displayed properties beyond current Soviet capacity to replicate: high heat tolerance, combined with extreme lightweight durability. Within 2 years, a classified report issued to the Soviet Air Forces described the Dresden recovery as instrumental in accelerating domestic progress toward high-altitude supersonic flight. No such statement ever entered the public record. Instead, the findings were buried in files labeled Special Collection. The CIA first caught wind of the Dresden cache in 1950 during the interrogation of a defecting Soviet engineer named Alexander Pavlenko. Pavlenko had worked briefly at a facility outside Kuibyshev, where he claimed foreign metals were being tested for new interceptor aircraft. In one interview transcript preserved in CIA archives, Pavlenko stated, "We knew the source was German. Officers called it the Dresden treasure. They told us the Americans would never know." This testimony was filed under CIA reference code CS 63621, but the agency lacked corroborating evidence. Officially, Pavlenko's claims were considered exaggerated, yet his descriptions of the alloys closely matched classified US metallurgical studies of captured Messerschmitt Me 262 jet components. An intelligence memorandum from the US Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC, dated November 14, 1951, reveals deeper unease. Soviet advances in high-speed aviation appear disproportionate to observed industrial capability. It is the opinion of this office that recoveries made by Red Army units in Saxony included experimental aircraft designs not yet documented in Western holdings. The memorandum was stamped secret and circulated only among senior Air Force staff. Notably, this was the same year the Soviets unveiled the MiG-15, whose performance shocked American pilots in Korea. The Dresden cache became a matter of urgent debate behind closed doors. If the Soviets truly possessed fragments of German prototypes, particularly those tied to advanced fuels, the balance of air power in the early Cold War was at stake. ATIC analysts speculated that Kraftstoff C13 might have been a precursor to high-energy propellants designed for vertical launch interceptors, the very concept later tested in Soviet rocket fighter projects. US attempts to locate comparable caches in the American occupation zones turned up little beyond scattered documents and incomplete prototypes. The uncomfortable conclusion, never admitted publicly, was that Moscow had seized the lion's share. By 1954, scattered references to the Dresden cache surfaced again in declassified MI6 documents. A report filed by a British informant in East Germany described shipments of sealed crates being moved under guard from Dresden to the Soviet sector of Berlin. The crates, he claimed, bore the same eagle and swastika markings seen in 1945. His report included a cryptic note: "They move, them at night, always with soldiers. Locals whisper they are cursed relics of the firestorm." MI6 circulated the intelligence under the file heading HX2419, but little follow-up occurred. The British were far more invested in nuclear intelligence at that stage, and aviation espionage took a back seat. The mystery deepened during the 1960s, when Western observers noted the Soviet Union's sudden leap in supersonic bomber and interceptor design. The Tu-22 blinder and the MiG-21 both incorporated features eerily similar to experimental sketches found in German archives, sketches thought destroyed in the bombing of Dresden. Former Luftwaffe engineer Walter Schreiber, who had surrendered to US forces in 1945, testified in a 1963 West German inquiry that the prototypes stored in Dresden could have altered the entire air war had they been deployed. His words, largely ignored at the time, now form one of the few direct acknowledgements by a German insider that the Dresden facilities contained valuable secrets. Attempts to verify the existence of the Dresden cache remain fraught. Soviet-era archives opened briefly in the 1990s contained tantalizing references, but no physical evidence. A document labeled Material Group Z, Disposition Log, 1946, lists 22 crates transported by rail to Moscow, though the contents are blacked out. Another, dated 1949, describes integration of foreign alloys into experimental structures, without elaboration. Western researchers who accessed these files in 1992 were denied permission to photograph them, and subsequent requests have been stonewalled. What can be said with certainty is that both NATO and Warsaw Pact intelligence agencies treated Dresden as a point of interest well into the Cold War. Declassified aerial reconnaissance photographs from 1961 show Soviet construction around the ruins of the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium Annex, despite its apparent lack of strategic value. Whether this activity related to ongoing exploitation of the cache or simple garrisoning remains uncertain. To this day, the Dresden cache occupies a grey zone between verified history and classified rumor. The fragments, metals, documents, fuels, were real enough to generate memoranda and inspire panic in Western intelligence circles. Yet no physical samples have ever surfaced in Western archives. For the public record, Dresden remains a city, remembered for destruction, not discovery. But in the closed halls of intelligence agencies, the whispers continue, that beneath the firestorm's ashes, the Soviets unearthed more than wreckage. They uncovered the remnants of a war Germany had, not yet lost, and in doing so, secured an advantage that carried them into the skies of the Cold War. In the chaotic summer of 1946, as Europe reeled from the devastation of the Second World War, a series of cryptic reports emerged from the mountains straddling the border of Italy and Yugoslavia. These were not the ordinary accounts of displaced persons or black market smugglers. Instead, they came from Allied intelligence officers piecing together rumors of a hidden Axis facility concealed in the Julian Alps. Codenamed Fortress Edelweiss by American analysts, the site was said to have been an SS stronghold where prisoners of war were subjected to brutal endurance experiments involving chemical agents. Though partisan forces reportedly neutralized the complex, no photographs, no bodies, and no structural remains were ever produced. The absence of evidence became the mystery itself. The earliest mention of Fortress Edelweiss appears in an OSS field report dated March 12, 1946. Stationed in Trieste, OSS officer Captain Raymond Bishop received testimony from a Yugoslav partisan commander named Dragutin Vukovic. Vukovic claimed his unit had attacked an enemy research station in the mountains during April 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender. The station, he said, housed foreign captives, mostly Soviet and Italian prisoners, who had been exposed to unknown chemical vapors in sealed chambers. According to his account, the facility was destroyed with explosives and sealed, burying the site under tons of rock. The OSS logged his statement, but dismissed it as partisan propaganda, aimed at attracting Allied aid, yet further testimony emerged. In September 1946, an Italian Carabinieri patrol investigating abandoned bunkers near Tarvisio reported finding tunnel entrances blocked by recent demolition charges. They noted scorch marks, spent shell casings, and crates marked with the SS Totenkopf emblem. The crates were empty. Their report, filed with the Allied military government in Udine, was forwarded to US Counterintelligence Corps, CIC officers. The CIC opened case file 187C, titled simply Edelweiss. The file ballooned over the following year, but was abruptly closed without conclusion in 1948. Portions remain classified to this day. One surviving memorandum, dated November 14, 1946, describes laboratory apparatus of advanced construction recovered from partisan caches near Ljubljana. Among the items was a steel cylinder etched with the designation Project Schwalbe Erford. Chemical analysis by US Army laboratories in Heidelberg found residues of an unknown compound, which the report described as irritant in nature, neurological in effect. The cylinder was later transferred to Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland for further testing. The trail goes cold there. No subsequent record of the cylinder has been found in American archives. Conflicting narratives emerged from Yugoslavia itself. Marshal Tito's government insisted the partisans had completely destroyed the installation, but Western diplomats in Belgrade reported rumors circulating among locals in the valleys beneath the Julian Alps that survivors of the SS garrison had escaped, blending into refugee flows, and that sealed tunnels still concealed things not meant to be seen. These whispers unsettled Allied occupation authorities, especially when, during NATO maneuvers in 1953, Italian Alpine troops reported stumbling upon sealed shafts deep in the mountains. Their after-action report noted massive iron doors welded shut, bearing scorch damage. No attempt was made to reopen them. The most chilling piece of testimony came from a Soviet source. In 1955, a KGB defector in Vienna told CIA handlers that the NKVD had long been aware of Fortress Edelweiss. According to his statement, Soviet intelligence had interrogated former SS officers who spoke of resistance tests conducted on prisoners using aerosolized compounds intended to simulate battlefield gas exposure. The goal, he claimed, was to study not death, but the prolongation of suffering. How long soldiers could remain functional after inhaling debilitating agents. The defector added that Soviet scientists had attempted to replicate these experiments using documents allegedly recovered from the site. His information was logged by the CIA under the cryptonym Red Vault, though analysts questioned its veracity. Despite these scattered reports, no conclusive proof of Fortress Edelweiss has ever been established. Allied intelligence agencies quietly purged references to it during the early Cold War, when Yugoslavia's alignment became a sensitive diplomatic matter. What remains are fragments, case files missing appendices, maps with coordinates redacted, photographs allegedly destroyed during archival weeding. One OSS officer, in a personal letter discovered decades later, wrote, "We knew something was up there. We just didn't want to admit what it was. Too ugly, too costly, and too late." Unconfirmed sightings continued well into the 1960s. Mountaineers reported stumbling upon rusted barbed wire and collapsed tunnels near the Mangart Pass. In 1967, a German newspaper ran an article alleging that the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, had retrieved documents from a Yugoslav archive proving the site's existence. The article was suppressed within days, the publisher pressured to retract. No such documents have surfaced since. The silence may speak louder than evidence. The absence of bodies, the vanishing files, and the consistent refusal of governments to address the subject suggest deliberate suppression. Fortress Edelweiss, if it existed, represented more than another forgotten bunker. It embodied the darker legacy of the Reich's desperation, an attempt to weaponize human endurance itself, hidden in the high peaks where snow and stone could erase the traces. The unanswered question lingers. Why seal the tunnels so thoroughly, and why has no government, east or west, moved to excavate them? The terrain remains uninhabited, the coordinates unmarked, as if the ground itself is off-limits. Perhaps the Allies wished to avoid scandal at Nuremberg, or perhaps the Soviets feared exposure of their own exploitation of the research. Whatever the reason, Fortress Edelweiss remains buried not only beneath the Julian Alps, but beneath layers of denial and silence. For investigators, historians, and intelligence analysts alike, it is a case defined by shadows. Too many reports to dismiss as myth, too little proof to declare as fact. The war ended, the files were sealed, and the mountains kept their secret. Yet the whisper of Edelweiss endures, a reminder that some corners of the Second World War were never brought fully into daylight and may never be. In January 1950, at the height of post-war uncertainty, and only months after the Soviet Union shocked the West by detonating its first atomic bomb, a memorandum circulated inside the US Air Force's Directorate of Intelligence. Stamped top, secret, and bearing the heading Electro-Atmospheric Concealment, The document referred to a Soviet project allegedly based on German wartime discoveries seized near Prague. The project, it claimed, involved the refinement of a compound described as red mercury, a metallic isotope of unknown stability. According to the memo, Soviet scientists were attempting to weaponize it, not as a conventional explosive, but as a means of manipulating radar and atmospheric signatures to conceal missile launches. The memorandum, quickly nicknamed the Red Mercury Brief by those who saw it, remains one of the most controversial Cold War files. The origins of the story trace back to May 1945, when advancing Red Army units captured a series of underground depots outside Prague. According to surviving German documents, these depots had been maintained by the Reichsforschungsrat, the Reich Research Council, and contained experimental materials from laboratories evacuated from Berlin and Breslau. Among the files was repeated reference to HGS, annotated in chemical shorthand, and accompanied by sketches of glass flasks sealed with heavy lead casing. The annotations suggested the material emitted intense thermal signatures when subjected to high-voltage currents. The German project was marked Feuerwetter, a codename translating to fire weather. Western intelligence never obtained samples. The caches had been seized exclusively by Soviet forces. By 1949, the US had begun hearing rumors from defectors and refugee scientists in occupied Germany. One Czech chemical engineer, interrogated at Camp King near Frankfurt, described hearing of Soviet research teams combing through Prague's captured laboratories. He claimed the Soviets were experimenting with compounds capable of creating false fronts on radar systems, allowing aircraft or missiles to appear as meteorological anomalies. His testimony, recorded in CIC file D2143, was initially dismissed as exaggerated hearsay, but when the Soviets unveiled their R-1 and R-2 missiles in rapid succession, US analysts began reconsidering whether a hidden accelerator was at work. The Red Mercury Brief itself was compiled in late 1949 from a mix of intelligence cables, intercepted radio traffic, and testimony from a German scientist spirited out of Czechoslovakia by MI6. The scientist, identified only under the alias Dr. K, claimed to have been present when Soviet NKVD officers supervised the transfer of sealed canisters from Prague to Moscow in June 1945. He stated unequivocally that the canisters contained a substance beyond conventional chemistry and that its effects, when tested, produced violent discharges of heat and light far exceeding expected energy. His deposition was forwarded to the Americans under cover of a Joint Intelligence Committee cable. The resulting Air Force memorandum, dated January 18, 1950, outlined worst-case scenarios. It warned that Soviet deployment of HGS, if stabilized, could allow them to mask long-range missile launches under what would appear to be atmospheric disturbances. The memo described artificial weather fronts, intense radar scattering, and potential nullification of existing early warning systems. Its language was deliberately cautious, but the tone conveyed alarm. The Soviets might not need to surpass American nuclear capabilities if they could render US detection systems blind. The memorandum recommended urgent counter-research under the guidance of the Air Materiel Command at Wright-Patterson Field. Then the file disappeared. By mid-1950, no reference to HGS or the Red Mercury Brief appears in surviving Air Force records. A handwritten note in one intelligence officer's diary hints at why. Subject suppressed. No discussion outside directorate. Possible disinformation origin, but classification retained to prevent exposure. Whether the suppression stemmed from doubts about the veracity of the intelligence or from fear of public panic remains unresolved. Yet fragments of the story persisted, resurfacing in CIA cables from Korea, where American pilots reported unexplained radar interference during the opening months of the war. In 1952, a classified CIA assessment on Soviet electronic warfare briefly referenced anomalous radar signatures consistent with atmospheric masking. The footnote cited Hagee source materials captured in 1945, Prague sector. Analysts, however, inserted the caveat: no confirmed deployment, possible deception. The same year, US scientists at Los Alamos began receiving sealed requests from the Pentagon for feasibility studies into radar scatter compounds. Their internal memoranda reveals skepticism, but also a sense of urgency. The very fact that Air Force is asking suggests they are aware of foreign experimentation. The Soviets, for their part, left subtle traces. In 1955, Soviet patent records, later reviewed by Western observers, showed filings related to high-density mercury isotopes and radar-reflective aerosols. Though disguised as civilian research, the language bore striking resemblance to the alleged properties of HGAS. Western analysts quietly linked these patents back to the Dresden and Prague seizures, though no government ever publicly accused Moscow of exploiting Nazi chemical files. Perhaps most troubling is the complete absence of the Red Mercury brief from official US archival releases. When the Air Force declassified thousands of documents in the 1970s, the memorandum was missing. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act have been met with the standard reply, "No records responsive." Yet testimonies from retired officers suggest otherwise. In a 1981 oral history interview, General Curtis LeMay casually mentioned the crazy Red Mercury scare we had back in '50, before quickly shifting topics. His offhand remark remains one of the few acknowledgements that the file ever existed. Skeptics argue the Red Mercury brief was nothing more than a Cold War hallucination, an exaggerated rumor born of fragmented intelligence, amplified by paranoia. But those who have examined the scattered references point out a recurring pattern. Every mention of HGS coincides with Soviet advances in aerospace and missile technology, achieved years ahead of Western projections. The sudden leap in Soviet radar countermeasure capacity, demonstrated during their 1957 launch of Sputnik, only deepened suspicions. Whether the compound existed as described, or whether it was a convenient label for unrelated advances, remains unresolved. What is certain is that the United States treated the possibility seriously enough to classify and suppress all discussion. A file that should have been dismissed as irrelevant instead vanished completely, buried in a system designed to protect the most sensitive truths. The Cold War was fought not only with bombs and missiles, but with shadows, disinformation, and half-seen science. In those shadows lies the story of the Red Mercury brief, a document that, if genuine, suggests the Second World War's scientific legacy extended far beyond rockets and jets, into domains where chemistry and deception merged. Officially, nothing was ever found. Unofficially, the silence says more than words ever could. In the spring of 1945, as American forces advanced into Bavaria, intelligence officers from the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, swept through Obersalzberg, the mountain retreat of Adolf Hitler and senior Nazi leadership. Among the crates of personal effects and party documents, one folder stood out. Stamped with the double lightning bolt insignia of the SS and marked "Nur für Dienstgebrauch," for official use only, the dossier contained training manuals, personnel, rosters, and psychological warfare outlines for a little-known SS formation. The unit, listed under the designation Sonderverband Bergmann III, was described not as a frontline regiment, but as a clandestine sabotage and infiltration division. Their existence was omitted from official Wehrmacht orders of battle. In post-war American records, this file became known simply as the Obersalzberg Papers. The papers outlined the creation of a specialized group trained to operate behind enemy lines, blending into civilian populations, disrupting infrastructure, and conducting psychological destabilization operations. Their methods included counterfeit identification, use of local dialects, and a systematic program of bombings staged to appear as the work of domestic dissidents. Unlike standard SS commando units such as Otto Skorzeny's, this formation was designed for long-term survival and covert re-entry into peacetime Europe. The file estimated the group's strength at 200-300 operatives, trained at facilities near Berchtesgaden between 1943 and 1945. Their codenames were unsettlingly mundane: Schreiner, Carpenter, Bauer, Farmer, Lehrer, Teacher. Each operative was trained to assume an unremarkable civilian identity. The papers did not list their ultimate deployment. The final notation in the folder dated April 20, 1945 read: Bereitstellung abgeschlossen. Einsatz erfolgt bei Zusammenbruch. Preparation complete. Operation begins upon collapse. The CIC archivist who logged the file, Sergeant Howard Klein, annotated in the margin, potential stay-behind unit, comparable to partisan tactics. His note was later redacted in subsequent copies. After the war, the dossier should have entered standard archival rotation. Instead, by 1947, it had disappeared from CIC holdings. Requests for the file in the 1950s were met with vague replies that no such unit existed, yet fragments persisted in unexpected places. In 1952, West German intelligence, the Gehlen organization, precursor to the Bundesnachrichtendienst, recorded rumors of unexplained sabotage incidents across Austria and northern Italy. Power lines cut, rail lines detonated, explosives of German manufacture recovered without serial markings. Gehlen himself, in a private briefing to US handlers, suggested elements of an SS sabotage cadre unaccounted for at war's end may be responsible. The strongest connection surfaced in 1961, when a bomb detonated outside a courthouse in Milan. Italian investigators initially attributed the attack to leftist radicals, but NATO counterintelligence specialists noted details eerily similar to SS sabotage manuals. Placement of the charge at a load-bearing point, use of a delayed chemical fuse, rather than an electronic detonator, and an improvised casing identical to designs in German wartime sabotage training texts. A secret NATO report circulated the following month drew parallels between the attack and instructions listed in the Obersalzberg papers. The report, marked Cosmic Top Secret, warned, unexplained incidents suggest survival of Reich-trained operatives. Infiltration of European civilian communities cannot be excluded. Vienna, too, experienced a series of bombings in the early 1970s targeting railway stations and municipal offices. Again, local authorities attributed the incidents to political extremists, but forensic evidence showed explosives constructed with methods outdated by decades, precisely those detailed in the missing SS manual. Austrian police quietly requested NATO assistance. A memorandum from Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, dated October 2, 1973, bluntly stated, repetition of obsolete sabotage techniques cannot be coincidental. Suggest review of 1945 Bavarian intelligence seizure. The Obersalzberg papers were specifically named, though NATO archivists reported the file as missing from holdings. The possibility that a Nazi stay-behind network had continued operating throughout the Cold War alarmed Western intelligence services, particularly given parallels with Gladio, NATO's own secret stay-behind program in Europe. To acknowledge the existence of an SS equivalent risked political fallout. Thus, the Obersalzberg papers were quietly erased from official discussion. When historians in the 1980s filed Freedom of Information Act requests for CIC files relating to Obersalzberg, the responses consistently denied any knowledge of such a dossier. Yet, oral histories tell another story. A retired CIC officer, interviewed anonymously in 1987, recalled, "We found the manuals. They looked like a blueprint for chaos. After that, everything just went dark. Independent researchers uncovered hints that the unit may have been partially absorbed into early Cold War clandestine networks. Italian parliamentary inquiries in the 1990s into Gladio operations revealed passing references to German operatives with unconventional training integrated into anti-communist cells. None of these references were substantiated, and officials insisted they referred only to debriefed ex-Wehrmacht personnel. Still, the overlap in tactics, bombings staged as communist terror, infiltration of unions, psychological disinformation, mirrored too closely the Obersalzberg doctrine to dismiss. The full truth remains buried. No names from the papers were ever confirmed, no personnel arrested, and no surviving manuals have surfaced. Yet the recurring signature of sabotage incidents, the unexplained disappearance of the original file, and the persistent whispers in intelligence communities point toward one possibility. Sonderverband Bergmann III was real, it deployed, and it survived the war. If so, its operatives may have walked unnoticed through post-war Europe. Ordinary citizens by day, trained saboteurs in reserve. In official history, Obersalzberg is remembered as Hitler's mountain retreat, reduced to ruins by Allied bombs. Unofficially, in the archives and whispers of intelligence agencies, it is remembered for something darker. A file that should not exist, training that should not have continued, and a cadre of men who may have carried the Reichswar into peacetime Europe. The Obersalzberg papers remain missing. Their silence continues to echo in every unexplained explosion that history insists was coincidence. The records remain redacted, the files missing, the tunnels sealed, yet their shadows bleed through history. From scorched laboratories to sealed bunkers, every silence conceals a choice. What truths are allowed to breathe, and which must suffocate in the dark? The war's aftermath was never peace, but a theatre of concealed horrors, where every unanswered question becomes a warning. Some ghosts are buried, not because they are gone, but because their return would be unbearable.